Even though it's Christmas, I thought it might be appropriate to say at least a little something about the current pandemic that we're in. Partially because, as I'm recording this, the province of Ontario is about to go into a full-blown lockdown, but also because COVID-19 has become sort of the unofficial theme of 2020. Now that said, instead of sort of giving a sweeping discourse as to how we might analyze our current situation in light of our Catholic faith, I thought we might simply focus on how to look at our current situation in light of the figure of St. Joseph. And so as you probably know, St. Joseph is the foster father of Jesus, the patron saint of Canada, and on top of that, the patron saint of the Universal Church. And in fact, to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the naming of St. Joseph as the patron saint of the Universal Church, Pope Francis recently issued this apostolic letter called With a Father's Heart, thereby naming this year of St. Joseph, if you will, beginning on December 8th, 2020, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, and of course ending on December 8th, 2021. Now, even though over the course of this particular document, Pope Francis cites any number of different characteristics of St. Joseph, for our purposes today, I just want to focus on a few different things. And so first of all, Pope Francis cites the really important point that St. Joseph is known for doing his work in such a way which is discreet and humble and hidden. And so, for example, instead of allowing himself to be unduly distracted by what could be or what he can't do or things which lie just beyond the scope of his ordinary duties, St. Joseph is perfectly content to focus on the duty of the present moment, which includes primarily working as a carpenter and raising the child Jesus as his own. And the whole idea here, to sort of paraphrase Pope Francis, is that we need to learn to really appreciate that the world is sustained by people who are often overlooked. You know, people like doctors and nurses, storekeepers, volunteers, caretakers, mothers and fathers. People who, through a great attentiveness to the duty of the moment, manage to convey a sense of shared responsibility and hope in a world which so desperately needs it. In any case, the second quality of St. Joseph that I kind of want to bring to your attention is the fact that quite simply he is a man of prayer. And you see, the thing I want to impress upon you is that instead of simply saying prayers, St. Joseph was about putting in the time and the effort to really get to know the Lord our God through a deep immersion in his sacred word, especially the Psalms, which would have been really helpful over the course of his daily life. Because you see, think of it like this. Even though it's true that Jesus, Mary, and Joseph clearly make up the Holy Family, if you look carefully at the Nativity story, there's also some really challenging circumstances which arise, which would seem to contradict that fact, which would have in turn challenged the faith of Mary and Joseph. Not unlike how I'm sure over the course of the current pandemic, your faith has been likewise tested. And so, for example, think about how there's no room in the inn, such that Jesus has to be born in a manger. Think about the murder of the holy innocents at the hands of King Herod and his men. Or think about how the Holy Family is forced to flee to Egypt, a place where they don't know the culture, they don't know the language, and they're forced to live in a land which has been historically hostile to their own people. And yet, because St. Joseph has this serious habit of prayer, built around the revealed Word of God, he knows for a fact that God is real, that he is Father, and that he is kind and merciful and just. And therefore he is able to find the strength and the endurance to persevere in the most challenging of storms. Now that said, for my money, one of the most interesting parts of Pope Francis's letter is when he talks about how 4 times God speaks to St. Joseph in the context of his dreams. And so first of all, as you might recall, in the aftermath of the Annunciation, an angel appears to Joseph in a dream and says, "Do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife." In the context of the second dream, the angel tells Joseph to flee to Egypt because Herod is looking to kill the Christ child. In the context of the third dream, St. Joseph is told to return to Israel because King Herod has apparently died. And then finally, in the context of the fourth dream, the angel says to St. Joseph, "Go back to Galilee because King Herod's son is still alive and he might still be hostile to the Christ child." Now, the reason why I want to spend a little time on this particular point is not so much to kind of unpack this idea of God speaking to people through their dreams, but rather to kind of emphasize this fact that St. Joseph, whenever he faces moments of crisis or difficulty, certainly uses his mind to kind of, clarify the options and weigh the pros and cons, but then ultimately he sleeps on it, based on the conviction that slowly, gradually, and in the fullness of time, God will ultimately reveal to him what the situation actually is, and therefore what it is he actually has to do. Now, I realize that on the face of it, that might sound like kind of a nothing little point, but it actually has great significance when it comes to the spiritual life. And so to illustrate the point, perhaps we might reflect on how we ourselves typically deal with moments of difficulty and stress. And so perhaps I must suggest that whenever we find ourselves in situations such as these, we tend to make quick judgments. Quick judgments about the situation at hand and quick judgments about the people involved, which obviously leads to all sorts of errors and mistakes. But you see, in contrast, perhaps I might give you a few different counterexamples, if you will. And so, for example, I remember one time speaking to this local bishop about the fact that, given the nature of his position, many times, he'll be bombarded by all sorts of various issues and problems, as a result of which he had to actively choose to resist the recurring temptation to say, look, because these things are similar, therefore they're the same. And instead to kind of cultivate the spiritual discipline, if you will, whereby he would deliberately choose to kind of give himself time and space, to allow his mind to relax, to allow his heart to settle down, such that he could see clearly what the situation actually is, and therefore what the Lord is actually calling him to do to move the situation along. In any case, to illustrate the same point in a slightly more offbeat sort of way, apparently back in the day in 1937, Walt Disney wanted to make a live-action/animated film focusing on the great works of Hans Christian Andersen, including such classics as The Ugly Duckling, The Little Mermaid, The Little Matchstick Girl, and The Snow Queen. But apparently the project never got off the ground because Walt Disney and his team couldn't figure out how to make the character of the Snow Queen actually sympathetic. But you see, the thing that's interesting is that instead of simply forcing the issue, they waited. And in fact, they waited for 75 years. And the way they ultimately resolved the problem is kind of interesting. They made the protagonist of the story the Snow Queen's sister, thereby changing the whole dynamic of the story such that instead of being this abstract fight between good and evil, it became about resolving family tensions between two sisters, thereby resulting in the 2013 classic Frozen, which of course is the greatest movie of all time. Okay, now obviously there's kind of a lot going on here, but it kind of begs the question, what does it all mean for us practically speaking? Well, perhaps I might distill everything we've been talking about today to basically 2 points. And so the first point is basically this. Whenever you find yourself in a situation where the solution is not immediately apparent, whether we're talking about a work-related situation, tensions in the family, or COVID-19, even though it's obviously appropriate and fitting to use your mind and your imagination and your intellect to analyze the situation, to clarify the various options, to weigh the various pros and cons, at the same time, you need to recognize that you're also called to resist the recurring temptation to make premature conclusions, in a sense of saying, this is for sure what the situation actually is, or this is definitely why this particular thing is actually happening. And on top of that, you're called to exercise a certain spiritual discipline whereby you give yourself all sorts of time and space to think, to pray, to ponder, to breathe, and to allow the truth of the situation to eventually emerge in a very natural and organic sort of way, in an atmosphere of peace, serenity, and calm. In any case, the second and final point is basically this. Whenever you're feeling stressed and you're inclined to sort of rationalize your impatience by saying that the issues you're dealing with are really important or pressing, think about the example of Joseph and consider that in the context of the Nativity story, he too has to deal with really important and pressing issues. And yet he never allows himself to get overly flustered, but instead, after having thought the thing through, he typically sleeps on it. And funny enough, you don't get the sense that St. Joseph's sleep is an agitated or restless sleep, in a sense of being in desperate need of melatonin, for example. But instead you get a sense that it's a very deep, calm, and peaceful sleep, born of a deep sense of trust in God, that God is his Father, and that whatever situation he's in, even this is within the scope of God's divine providence. And so therefore he can simply let go and trust that he can be still and know that the Lord is God. And may God bless you all.